Welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and thrilled to be with you today for our virtual reading group. We are continuing to read Hannah Arendt's book, The Crises of the Republic, or Crises of the Republic, um, a book that is ever more timely. We've planned these beautifully. We read the essay Civil Disobedience right along the time that the events in Minneapolis were transpiring. And now we are on to her essay on violence um, at a moment in which not only are we experiencing civil unrest, but also debate around the use of AI in violence, and of course, a war, which has just started um, in the Middle East. So these topics are not irrelevant. Let's just start there. And yet, we should also remember that the essay that we're about to read was written in 1969 and published in the New York Review of Books. So it's not written for today. Um, that doesn't mean it's not relevant. I think it is, but we should be wary of just assuming a one-to-one relevance. Um, this is one of Arendt's, I think, more widely read essays. And um, we're actually, just for quite quick little advertisement, we're actually hosting a conference on violence in April at the Arendt Center, 2 days, April 23rd and 24th. Jess Feldman, our postdoctoral fellow, is running that. And Jess, maybe you can put a little information in the chat about the conference. But that should be an exciting 2-day event. This essay, as I said, is popular. Um, it's it's mostly read for part two. So the essay takes place in three parts: part one, part two, part three. Um, Part one is what we're going to talk about today, and it's probably the least liked part of the essay, and often the most criticized part of the essay, but also I think the least understood part of the essay. Um, I call it Violence and Its Instruments. The second part of the essay is on the difference between power and violence. And this is the most liked and most read part of the essay. And then part three, um, which argues that violence is separate from power, um, is the culmination of the essay, and we'll read that as well. I I have broken the essay up in our discussions in three parts, in these three different parts, because I think it's so complicated, and and I think it's an essay that is often people take one or two things from it, but they don't try and understand it as a whole. And you could say, well, if you want to understand the whole, why are you breaking it up into three parts? And it's a good question. But I'm hoping that in slowing down and reading it part by part, we'll be able to give it a kind of attention that is not usually given to this essay, and try and show the way in which the three parts actually hold together. And that's going to be my effort to do so. It is it's um one of Arendt's essays that's most connected to real events, right? And you'll see that in the footnotes, uh, and also in the appendix and the appendices. There's like 20 something or almost 30 appendices uh, written in this essay, and I'm not going to be talking about them for the most part as we read, but I hope in the Q&A some of you will bring them up, because they're really where she is addressing other people in articles in newspapers and speeches, talking about some of these issues. And I can't, it's just too complicated to bring everything into it, but I hope you'll bring up specific events that she's talking about, and allow us to to talk about them and consider them. So, what is the essay on violence about from 1969? I think that you can understand it if you take a look at if you're using the Crisis of the Republic edition, page 132, which is the last page of part one. So we're reading today part one, the last page of part one, and in that on that page, Arendt asks, she says, if we look on history in terms of a continuous chronological process. This is in the last paragraph on page 132, second sentence, right? If we look on history in terms of a continuous chronological process. So look at history as things going chronologically in a process, whose progress, moreover, is inevitable, right? And this is a thesis that she is clearly against, does not believe in. But she thinks it is the Marxist thesis, and she thinks it's the thesis of many of these social scientists who she's engaged with, who think that things follow one after the other. She says, if we look at history as a process, violence in the shape of war and revolution may appear to constitute the only possible interruption. It's a very compelling and simple idea, right? If history is a process, right? If you think that the world is a system and that everything happens, because one thing follows the other, and we can't stop it, and it's just inevitable almost. Then she says, violence, right, in the shape of war and revolution might be the only way to interrupt the process. It's like the way to put a wrench in the machine, in the gears. And she says, if this were true, if only the practice of violence would make it possible to interrupt automatic processes in the realm of human affairs, the preachers of violence would have won an important point, right? If it were true that A, things happen in a process, and B, violence is only the only way to stop the process, then those who preach violence would have an important point. She says, however, it is the function, however, of all action, as distinguished from mere behavior, to interrupt what otherwise would have proceeded automatically and therefore predictably. And this is her general argument that she begins in the human condition with, and has been so important in her work, that it's not only violence that can interrupt the processes of history, right? Human action, acting together, collective action, could be civil disobedience, could be nonviolence, it could be a great speech, it could be a union action, it could be a new political party emerging. Whatever it is, all sorts of action is capable of interrupting the processes of history and making changes. And so a big part of what she wants to argue here is that you don't need to turn to violence to inaugurate political change. In fact, she wants to almost make the opposite case, right? That violence is not the highest form of political action, which she thinks that a lot of these preachers of violence are arguing, but that violence is actually a substitute that appears when we give up on political action because power throughout society has collapsed. And so the core intellectual distinction of the essay in part 2 and part 3 between power and violence, right, is set up by her critique of the preachers of violence here in part 1, who she thinks are presenting violence as a necessary way of acting to make political change in the world. But she's actually saying, A, action can work without violence, and B, violence is a symptom of actually the impotence of political action. A violence appears where power and politics no longer work, where they're in jeopardy. And this is the ultimate, I think, thesis, one of the main theses of the whole essay, but certainly what she's trying to present here in part one. So in doing so, Arendt is really attacking two of the deepest assumptions of modern social science, right? And this is a theme of hers, right? The first is that the idea of history operates according to laws or processes, right? She's going to contest that. And the second is a liberal, sometimes Marxist faith in the inevitability of progress, right? If these two assumptions, right, of that's history as a process and that it is a process leading to progress, that the arc of history bends towards justice, if these assumptions collapse, then the whole justification for both technocratic governance, which leads us along the steps and processes of history, and for revolutionary violence to sometimes break that system and to inaugurate a new and better system, both of those start to look much less convincing. And this is Arendt's hope, is that they will look less convincing and that the world will become open to both the unpredictable initiative of human beings acting together, such that, secondly, we see history not as a process, but as a web of unpredictable human actions.
I can't even.
And in that world, violence is not the engine of history. It is a sign that genuine political power has broken down. All right, that's a general overview of sort of the place of part one in the essay. I'm going to now walk us through part one a little bit more, step by step. And let me say, this is a tough essay to follow, right? If you read part one and you're like, what in the world? You're not alone. This is Arendt Arendt is a brilliant writer, but she can be an infuriating writer. She's brilliant in that she's able to condense incredible ideas into epigrams and aphorisms that are powerful. She's Nietzschean in that sense. But at times her work works around the issue, and this is one of those essays where it's often hard to find a coherent through line. And yet I think we can, if we look at it, we can make some sense of it. So as I said, part one overall, I call violence and its instruments. And the first part of part one, I'm going to break it into a number of parts to try and make it accessible. The first part, she begins with a factual observation about the 20th century, which I think is also relevant for the 21st century. And she says in the 20th century, two things have changed. One is we live in a century of wars and revolutions. Well, we just started another war. That hasn't stopped. We've had many revolutions. In fact, this war is designed to bring about a revolution. Whether or not that has any chance of success or not, we'll see. But it is still a century of wars and revolutions. And the second is that the technical development of the implements of violence has reached a point where political goals can no longer justify them. She's clearly thinking here, when she's writing this, of things like nuclear weapons, right? But also of carpet bombing. We may think today of drone warfare, which can just, come into people's lives and put a stake through someone's heart, or AI, which could, in a sense, destroy an entire city, cut off food supply, cut off water and electricity, starve people, things like that. The point is that technology has radically expanded the scale of destruction that is possible. And so war, which once had a political logic, right? War was politics by other means. Now, the means of war are so destructive that they overwhelm the ends. They annihilate the political world itself. And this is the crisis with which she starts the essay. That violence is a technical means, it's an implement. Right? She starts there. But violence has grown so enormously destructive that it's hard to justify its political use. I mean, what would it mean to use nuclear weapons? Right? What would it mean to unleash biological warfare that destroys an entire population? What would it mean to use AI to, in a sense, starve an entire civilization? Um, uh, and and so the argument she's making is that the technological means overwhelm the ends that could justify violence. And that this is always possible in a means ends logic. And she suggests that this may mean that war becomes increasingly unlikely. Now, you could say, oh, we just started a war. That seems like she's wrong. Well, what she means is total war, right? War that is willing to use the means we have at our disposal. And one thing we realize is we're generally not willing to use all the means at our disposal. There are plenty of weapons we have that we don't use, and so she would think these more as what Putin calls it, like military actions or whatever. Um, but war, there are means that just seem almost unjustifiable to use them. Okay, that's the first move of the essay. The second part of part one of the essay is that the intellectual response to the, in a sense, irrationality of the means of violence attempts to rationalize violence, and it does so by mistaking calculation for thinking. Right? So the point is that under these circumstances where violence is so wildly destructive, she says there are few things more frightening. This is on page 108. Few things more frightening than the steadily increasing prestige of scientifically minded brain trusters in the councils of government during the last decades. She's talking about people with PhDs, people who work for the Rand Corporation or the Heritage Foundation or Brookings or whatever, people who come in and try and game out what it would mean to use AI in a war, or what would it mean to have a blockade and starve a people, whether in Taiwan or Ukraine or Iran or whatever. And she says the trouble with these people is not that they're cold-blooded enough to think the unthinkable, but that they do not think. Well, what does she mean by that? She's saying that they calculate, well, what would happen if we do this? What would happen if we do that? They create hypotheses upon hypotheses. The hypothesis leads to a fact, which then we think is a fact, which births a whole similar new hypotheses and new facts, which forgets the speculative nature of the enterprise. Her point is that the danger in these theories are not only that they're plausible, but that they take their evidence from present trends, from things that they see in the world. And because they have a consistency, right? We say, well, if this happens, this happens, this happens, this happens. They have a kind of, they have what she calls a hypnotic effect. They put to sleep our common sense, which is nothing else but our mental organ for perceiving, understanding, and dealing with reality and factuality, right? That's on page 109. Her point is that, in Vietnam, you had these new mandarins, these people who, put out these reports, and they somehow thought that if they could control the facts and control the reports, they could control the events and make something happen. They believed that we could somehow um, rationalize the war and make the war come out the way we wanted it to. And yet she thinks events are beyond our control. She also cites this wonderful review by Richard Goodwin, The Unthinkable and the Unanalyzable from the New Yorker. All right, this is again, she's talking about things she's reading on a daily basis. Um, it's a review of Thomas Schelling's Arms and Influence. Some of you may know Thomas Schelling. He ended up winning the Nobel Prize in economics for precisely the theory, the game theory analysis that Arendt here is criticizing. Schelling tries to analyze what it would mean to win a nuclear war using game theory and rational choice modeling and escalation scenarios, right? And she says these kind of things to think, what would it mean to win a nuclear war? Um, and he comes up with these brilliant insights like using nuclear weapons increases the danger of a wider war, which Richard Goodwin says is, sort of funny in a way. And um, and Arendt says that, these are symptoms of pseudoscientific political analysis. This, of course, is someone who won the Nobel Prize for economics. Um, and and what Schelling is famous for is thinking about the unthinkable. But what Arendt is saying is this kind of thinking about the unthinkable is not thinking; it's calculating. Um, and and she cites as sort of a final nail in the coffin of this Proudhon's famous phrase, one of my favorite phrases: "The fecundity of the unexpected far exceeds the statesman's prudence." So, so in this second part, she's really interested in how these extraordinary new means of violence, the implements of violence, lead a whole new class of mandarins who take over the Defense Department and the social, and much of government and much of the think tanks, lead them to think that they can somehow make this thing calculable, make it meaningful, and they actually hypnotize themselves and ourselves and put us to sleep. She then shifts, right, in a third part of this introduction to the intellectual tradition that she says legitimates violence philosophically. And there's a history to this, right? There's people like Clausewitz, who I already said his formula is that war is a continuation of politics by other means. The idea is that the violence of war is rationalized and legitimated by politics. There's a certain Marxist revolutionary theory which treats violence as the midwife of history. History is happening, and violence is simply a way to hurry it up. And then there's thinkers like Frantz Fanon and Jean-Paul Sartre who glorify violence as liberating and creative. And she says all these theories share a deeper assumption, which is that violence has a kind of world creating or transformative power. And she wants to push back against this idea. For Arendt, violence can destroy, but it can't really create new political orders, right? This is similar to an argument we confronted in the essay Lying in Politics and also her essay Truth in Politics, where she says, look, power can create new lies that are believed, but it can't in the end create truth. Because if power creates a truth, there will be new power that will fight that truth. And there's no way to stabilize truth just with power. In a similar way, Arendt is saying that violence can destroy, but it can't build. She then moves to this account of the student rebellions from the 1960s and the student glorification of violence. And these are very nuanced pages and I think need to be read carefully. She begins by saying, let's grant the moral seriousness of the students that what they did required real courage and action, and that who would have expected after the 1950s, this time of utter conformity, that young students would engage in a moral crusade like the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. And so she gives them that credit, and she as many of us know who know of her time in that her actions in that time, she was very sympathetic with many of the student movements. But she says, why did it happen? And she says, it's a global phenomenon. It happened all over the world, and you can't come up with all these things, all these particular reasons that people gave. One fits the U.S. or one fits California, one fits Germany, one France. But how do you understand this worldwide global phenomena? And she has this, I think, haunting answer in some sense that this new generation of students who growing up in the 60s are those who hear the ticking of the bomb. They are the ones who grew up with uh, 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 with technology, that all technologies could be weaponized, all technologies could ruin the world, and that the sense of the future and the sense of that there might be a future, especially in a world of nuclear weapons, um, uh, is something that they don't share. I, I don't think today people feel that same way about nuclear weapons, but I think AI uh, is having a similar impact on many young people today. I mean, as someone who teaches young people, everyone thinks, oh, all these young people want to use AI. That's not my experience at all. I actually, in my experience, many of my students are scared to death of AI. They don't want to touch it. They resist it because I think it's horrifying. It's terrifying to them. It teaches them that they may not exist in 5 years, that humans may not exist. And it's out of this psychological environment, which I think was similar to the way that young people in the 60s saw nuclear weapons, um, where action becomes more important than the results. Violence becomes attractive because it creates the feeling of action, even if that action doesn't accomplish anything. Um, I wrote a piece a number of years ago on politics and protest, in which, I looked at a number of theorists of anarchism and protest, people like Simon Critchley and David Graeber and Jacques Rancière, and and these are people who basically say that the only way to experience freedom today is through protest, not through building new institutions, because institutions are always oppressive, but always protesting. And Arendt was very suspicious against that view. I mean, that's the argument of my essay. But here, Arendt is saying that too many of these young people come to see action as valuable for its own sake. And this leads to the glorification of violence that Arendt now is critical of, and that she critiques primarily in Jean-Paul Sartre, also Frantz Fanon. Um, Sartre writes about violence as purifying, as transformative, as existentially authentic. Violence becomes a way to experience agency, to feel alive. It proves that you're not a cog in a bureaucratic society. And for Arendt, this is deeply mistaken, right? Violence may feel like action, but she thinks it doesn't actually lead to genuine political action. Um, she then considers a number of points that Sartre emphasizes in Fanon's book, The Wretched of the Earth. And one should be very careful here. Arendt is defensive about Fanon. She says Fanon is better than Sartre and better than most because she reads the whole book. And if you read the whole book, The Wretched of the Earth, you know that in the last chapter, Fanon is actually very critical of the capacity of violence to create agency. But most people only read the first chapter, especially today. And Sartre, she says, really only read the first chapter. And he elevates up um idlers and gangsters and says things like hunger without dignity is preferable to bread eaten in slavery, which of course Fanon did say, but Sartre emphasizes it in a way that Fanon didn't. And Arendt thinks this is crazy, right? No real proletarian thinks that hunger without dignity is preferable to bread eaten in slavery. Um, she calls this a romanticization of violence that appears in Sartre's reading of Fanon, and she says rests on a misunderstanding of politics and social reality. Um, and this leads her to one of the more controversial elements of this text, one that I think has led this first section to be misread so badly and often dismissed, where she says that it's especially white people who are susceptible to this glorification of violence, right? She says that white student radicals are often detached from concrete social interests. They don't represent a class or an oppressed group or an economic movement. And so their rebellion becomes theoretical and symbolic. It is often inspired by ideological narratives, and this detachment from concrete interests makes the violence more tempting, and it becomes a kind of dramatic gesture rather than a strategic political goal. And she contrasts that with Black power, which she says is different. She says that Black power movements are actually grounded in real material interests. They need things like civil rights, political representation, economic equality, and protection from violence. And because these movements, she says, are tied to concrete goals, their use of violence remains instrumental and limited and less glorified as it is for white people. And thus, the Black claims of power and violence, she thinks, are actually more successful and more widely understood as part of a real class struggle, and that makes them more politically rational, even when they engage in violence. But the deeper problem that Arendt is here struggling with is that the student radicals confuse violence with action. They believe that violence proves that they have agency, whereas for Arendt, as I've said, violence destroys and action is what creates. What's really going on here, and in the last section of the essay, I just want to turn to that, and she now makes this transition to the question of Marxism, and she says, why do these glorifiers of violence, who are talking about not politics but sort of an existential glorification of violence, why do they still speak the language of Marxism when they're so far from Marx, right? She says Marx's historical theory places its faith not in violence, but in historical processes, namely the development of the productive forces and class contradictions. Violence for Marx is only a midwife. It's an instrument that might accompany the processes, but it doesn't actually have value in and of itself. The student radicals, however, right, are actually arguing that violence itself is good. And so she says they're not really Marxists at all, right? They believe that history unfolds. They no longer believe that history unfolds like Marx did through objective social processes. And so what's going on here? And she says what's going on is that we've changed our understanding of progress, right? We once believed in historical progress in the 19th century. Marx thought that there was a progress, that the arc of history bends towards justice. But if there is no historical process guaranteeing change, if the world is about to end with nuclear war or AI, right? We don't really care about progress. We just want to feel good. And violence can help us feel good. Violence becomes, in a sense, a creator of a kind of sense of power. And this is the position that Arendt worries about in Sartre and Fanon. And so just to end up, if the 19th century saw a belief in progress and violence as a midwife of history, the 20th century sees the collapse of progress, the collapse of a future, and violence is reimagined as a creator of history. But Arendt views both of these as misunderstandings. For her, it is not violence which can interrupt historical processes and create, but action. And that's what she's going to try and develop in the latter two parts of the essay, where she tries to distinguish power from violence and say the confusion and the collapse of power into violence has prevented us from understanding that we actually still have power, that we still have the power to build and create new public worlds. Okay, I'm going to stop there and look forward to our conversation. As you know, if you've been with us, there's two ways to participate. One is through the chat. Um, please do be respectful of your colleagues. And I love the fact that so many people do chat and get involved in it. I can't follow the chat and answer your questions at the same time. So you can also, if you'd like, and I encourage you to, go down to the react button, click on it, and raise your hand. I will get a piece of paper to write on, and I look forward to your discussion, your questions, and our discussions. Thanks very much. The first question is from iPhone, and I can't see who it is. So
Can you see me now?
the light, you have a light coming across your face. So
Okay, yeah,
it's all
no,
right. It
no,
doesn't
no.
matter.
It's fine.
What's your name?
Um, yeah, no, I was wondering, oh, it's Hal. I've participated in these before. I was wondering because there is the discussion of sort of means ends rationality with regards to sort of the instruments of war. In other words, war just becomes a matter of the instruments themselves. And of course, we saw the whole AI anthropic incident this week. And one thing that Arendt is discussing here is this is sort of associated with a sort of pseudo scientific social science ideology. And I was wondering how we can relate this to sort of the value of the humanities in the era of AI. There was an article in the New York Times today by one of the former labor secretaries saying, oh, yeah, no, AI is going to, we need to essentially revamp education around adapting to AI. And I was wondering, like, okay, this is the social science. What's the role in the humanities in all of this, and how can they help us understand sort of the break with this sort of uh, overt focus on means edge rationality when you're using AI, not really understanding where you're going.
Yeah, no, I think I actually just read that article a couple minutes before we started today by what's her name? Gina Raimondo, right? Um, uh, yeah, I mean, I'm not sure the violent. So are you asking about violence or more just about AI and how the humanities can respond to AI?
Well, Mask in particular, she says one of the problems is that the instruments of violence too often become sort of the subject of this social scientific ideology. Hold on, I'll have to find the quote, but it's I'm not using the same edition as you. This is a British edition,
Hmm.
but it's discussing. This is it's about sort of the means of oh, yes, here it is. A revolution in tool making. The very substance of violent action is ruled by the means ends category, since the end of human action is distinct from the end products of fabrication, can never be reliably predicted. The means, in this case, it would be possibly AI, such as Anthropic, used to achieve political goals are more often than not of greater relevance to the future role to the future than the intended goals.
Yeah,
And later, there's discussion when she quotes Noam Chomsky about how the social sciences are used as sort of this pale imitation of sort of like the hard sciences, and maybe you'd create a military plan based on using AI in this like pseudoscientific way.
yeah. No, I think that like it's a great question and it's important. The basic idea, right, which you've articulated, is that, you know, when you use these extremely powerful means, right, we can justify it with ends, but we don't know what the end, of using AI is going to be. Um, and so, but the fact that we're using AI and we're increasingly creating a war that is inhuman, may be more impactful in the future than whatever the ends of the war might be. And that's true in war. It's true in our work. I mean, you may use AI to write a paper for school, or use AI to write a grant proposal and think, oh, well, the ends, getting the grant proposal, justify the means, using AI, right? And I do it too, so I'm not criticizing it. Um, but the means, right, that AI becomes the way we do our work may mean that we stop learning to write and we stop learning to think, and we increasingly cease to engage in that human activity, or at least be good at it. Um, uh, and I think those are real questions. And so what Arendt wants to say here is, um, the glorification of violence or the glorification of AI, which we see all around us today, um, uh, you know, has a reason, right? It can violence can make us feel powerful, and AI can make us feel useful and efficient. Um, but it has other consequences, and we need to consider those as well. Uh, and she doesn't think that violence will ever build anything. Will AI really make human life better? That's a question that I think it's very hard for us to know the answer to. Um, what is a humanist response to AI? I think it's one of the great questions facing us today. I've written some pieces on it. But what I've argued, and in the pieces I've written on it, I've actually referred to this group and said, look, one way to um, respond to AI is simply to still continue to read and talk about texts and people and ideas with other human beings. Um, this is how we keep our humanity. It's how we learn to talk, listen, engage, think. Um, and in a world in which more and more of our world is going to be governed by AI, um, simply humanist activities where we sit together around a table or here in front of a computer and talk to each other and listen to each other is one way to, I think, continue to build and affirm what it means to be human. But I think we're all in for one hell of an experiment, and I don't know where it's going to go. So thank you, Katie.
Yeah, thanks. I have a clarification question. It's about something she says on page 121, in my copy at least, when she's talking about the Black Power movement on campuses. And she makes this side comment about Black students committing or condoning verbal or actual violence. And I never thought of Arendt as having a view about speech being violent. And I'm wondering if she did. I'm partially cursed because, like many of you, I'm on a university campus, and so talk about discursive violence is quite common.
Yeah. So it's a good question because you don't think of Arendt, right, as someone who talks about um discursive violence. She's here referring to an article. So if you look, she cites right at that point, she cites she says go to Appendix 6. And Appendix 6 is concerned um, first with Fred Hecklinger's article Campus and Campus Crisis. Um, but then more importantly for your question, um, James Foreman's manifesto to the white Christian churches and the Jewish synagogues in the United States. Um, and uh, what she's thinking, what she's really talking about, I think, with verbal violence here, um, is James Foreman. She doesn't think much of it, right? She says its content, his manifesto, to be sure, is half illiterate fantasy and may not be meant seriously, but it is more than a joke, and that the Negro community moodily indulges today in such fantasies is no secret. That the authorities should be frightened is understandable. What can neither be understood nor condoned is their lack of imagination. Is it not obvious that Mr. Foreman and his followers, if they find no opposition in the community at large and even are given a little appeasement money, will be forced to try to execute a program which they themselves perhaps never believed in? So what she's talking about here is that she thinks that um, people like Foreman are basically, uh, in a sense. I mean, he was also an artist and a playwright, right? She's saying it's performative and not really meant. So what is that? And yet it's also uh, popular. Um, uh, I think the line she's trying to tread here is that on the one hand, she's arguing that the black political movements of the students are more interest based and more real than the white students, and that's why they're popular. And yet some of the black student or rebellion, like George, like Foreman, um, is she thinks divorced from reality. Um, uh, and yet, it still retains a certain popularity. She thinks because of its claim of because there is a real, unlike the white students, there really are needs of the black students that need to be met, and so she thinks that they have a kind of support, even though she thinks some of their statements are not even meant in seriousness. That's as good as I can do. Um, she then says that black violence can be understood in analogy to labor violence, right? And again, this is her attempts to say that the black violence is actually connected to real interest, like the proletariat in the labor movement. And that's why she thinks it has more sense and more popularity than the white student radical violence. But I don't know. Does that help with what your question is? I mean, I'm not, your question was specifically about the verbal um, or actual violence of the black students. Yeah, I don't know why she puts in verbal there, to be honest with you. I'll have to stop there. Okay, Burma.
Yes, thank you. I'm trying to understand how power and violence connects to her notion of crisis in plural. Her overall title is Crises of the Republic. We had the notion of crisis in her earlier books, Between Past and Future, Origins of Totalitarianism. And so this chapter responds to the crisis of those days in the 60s, Vietnam War, nuclear debates, student civil rights movement, a technocratization of the means of war, all that. Now today, the crises of today are very often framed in terms of poly-crisis or meta-crisis. The idea of multiple distinct crises such as geopolitical, technological, environmental, social, not only occurring simultaneously, but also interacting with each other, so that crises amplify each other, producing outcomes that are much more severe than the sum of the individual crisis. So my question is her idea on her idea that the use of violence is a sign that power has broken down. That idea is so strong that I would very much like to understand what would it mean, um, her thinking about the lack of transformative power of violence, or that the use of violence is a sign that power has broken down. What would this mean for what Adam Tooze and so many others call polycrisis or meta-crisis? What would it mean for the crisis and the amplification of crisis today, in your view?
Thanks. Thanks, Burma. Yeah, I think so. I think that there's a number of ways this essay speaks to the crises in plural of the Republic. One is we didn't talk about it, but insofar as she does think of war, right, as the as politics by other means and as the ultimate ratio of politics through violence. Um, uh, in that sense, she thinks that most nation states and the old European nation states give into that idea because they're stuck in an idea of sovereignty, in which you need to exert violence in order to defend your sovereignty. And she says that the only place that doesn't necessarily need to embrace that kind of violence to defend its sovereignty and independence is the United States, right? This is in a parenthetical bracket in our edition on page 107 to 108, where in parentheses she says, the United States of America is among the few countries where a proper separation of freedom and sovereignty is at least theoretically possible, insofar as the very foundations of the American Republic would not be threatened by it. And so she thinks that in America, at least you could, in principle, as a republic, as a federalist republic, allow for different competing ways of life within the republic, and also that foreign treaties, which become part of the Constitution, are law of the land, would mean that you could create treaties and in a sense expand the sovereignty of the United States in a way that she thinks the countries of Europe cannot do. But she thinks that, of course, the United States has refused that tradition and become more of a sovereign imperial state. That's one way to understand it. Another, going, I think, deeper into the text, and it's where you were headed, is to say that for her, if you're going to create a republic of freedom, right, a constitution of freedom, as she talks about in chapters 4 and 5 of On Revolution, you're going to have to multiply power, and you're going to have to engage in and allow citizens to engage in participation in government in a way that allows them to actualize their power and be free, because to be free is to act collectively and have power for her. And that means that you're going to have to provide institutions in society that allow for power to be exercised. Insofar as we are glorifying violence and confusing violence with power, she thinks we don't do that. And so, insofar as a republic for her is the constitution of freedom, she thinks that the turn to violence at the expense of power is a crisis of freedom and a crisis of politics. Well, this is going to be the sort of core of her argument in part 3 of the text, and I think it's where this text is going, right? Which is that you, in a republic, you have to allow people to exercise power, but not violence, and that's going to be the distinction she's going to make. So thank you. Does that help, Burma? I hope.
Oh yes,
Yeah.
certainly.
And certainly when we read section 3, we'll spend more time on that. Susan.
Two things. One, on page 120, I just have to go on record to say
Hold on. I got to get there.
Find the statement outrageous.
Which statement?
The statement that Negro students, the majority of them admitted without academic qualification, regarded and organized themselves as an interest group. And then she says their interest was to lower academic standards. I don't even think, well, anyhow, I find that an outrageous statement. The other thing is that when you were talking about having no view of the future, of having a future, I think you talked about AI, but I think climate change is very much that as well for the current generation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, yeah, so look, I mean, I don't I'm not I'm not in favor of going on record or off record. She says what she says. Um, she was teaching at Berkeley at the time. Um, and this is simply what some of the students, many of the students were saying. You don't have to agree with what the students were saying. And I think obviously today, if we were to say that that's what students want, I think it would be outrageous. But at the time, that was part of the demands of the students. And if you look at page 191, right, um, she cites Bayard Rustin, who's critical of the students for precisely the same issues, right? One of the great civil rights leaders of the time. Now, I'm not saying that Bayard Rustin can't be wrong too, um, but she's making a point here that many civil rights leaders made as well, um, uh, and um, and I think it's simply a factual point on one level, and Bayard Rustin is saying actually it's a mistake, um, as you know, he writes about the students that the college officials had stopped capitulating to the student demands of Negro students. That's Bayard Rustin that she's citing. Um, um, Again, you know, we may not like it, and it may go against what we would say, and certainly it's not what we would say today, because I don't think it's what the students are saying today. Um, but I think it's what she was addressing at the time. Steve.
Hi. Hello everybody. Um, well, I was just going to say, like, because you mentioned earlier about the footnotes and so on, I was very cheered when I read this again by Arendt's foresight and um, her complete sympathy with the with black people and the black movements in general. I mean, it would be, I know reading that sentence on page 120 is a little like funny in our ears these days, but I think what she's referring to, at least when I read this book with Elizabeth Youngbrul, what she was referring to there was the demand at the City University of New York that it used to be a competitive entry based on exams and your averages in high school and other stuff, and in favor of open admissions. And according to many, it changed the character of the institution. That's what, according to Elizabeth, that's what she was referring to. So I just, but if what was offensive about the remark was that it might signal some prejudice on the part of Hannah Arendt towards the black community, I would like to go on the record as saying that did not exist. She was well ahead of her time in terms of her attitude towards the black community. Anyway, that's I wanted to make just some remarks that occurred to me while I was reading this. By the way, I just read it straight through. Are we up to page 138 yet?
No, but that
Okay, then I'll save that for next time. Okay. So one thing that I kept in mind when I was reading this, is that, for all the polymath qualities of Hannah Arendt, her native language is German. The German word for power is Macht. Macht derives from the verb um, to
Machen.
do, machen, yeah, to do or to create. It has a dynamic quality to it in almost all of its uses. Whereas English and French, uh, pouvoir, is indicates the capability of something, the capacity to do something. It's an essentially static quality. It describes something that could be done but hasn't yet. So I was struggling with her emphasis on definitions until I like thought about that for a while, and I realized, oh yeah, like her native training is towards things that are dynamic. And so that, I don't know if that helps anybody else. It helped me a great deal. Um, and then the last thing is that violence on the you talked earlier. You said violence as the handmaiden of history. Um, I think that language. All it's also been famously said. I think it's Karl Kraus who said that language is the mother and not the handmaiden of thought. Um, and yeah, I'm pretty sure that's what it was. So I'm pointing that out because this is a difficult essay, and it has hair-splitting definitions. And when I kept in mind the distinction between the dynamic of the German and the static quality of the English and French, it helped me. So I'm hoping it helps others. That's all I had to say.
Thanks, Steve. There's a lot in there. Just to say that if one hears in the English power
Yeah,
from the Latin potentia,
yeah,
there's also a non-static, quite active tense of potence of potentia
yeah.
of action and power. So, but we'll talk more about that in the next session when we talk about power and violence in part two. You know, uh, I think what your comments are great. I don't want to defend Arendt or not defend Arendt. That's not my job on race. I mean, I think she read widely. Um, she did not, she was not. I mean, one of the things that I think is true about her is she didn't make many close black friends. Um, she didn't, she knew some people. She met Baldwin. She met a couple of folks, Ellison, I think once. Um, but she didn't, they weren't part of her inner circle. She didn't, unlike some of the other Jewish emigres, she didn't. And and I think that's one of the reasons that sometimes I think she says things that grate on us. And I think Susan, points some of that out. That said, it gave her a kind of impartiality and distance, which can be grating, as she often said. I'm not a very likable person. Um, she didn't write to be liked. She wrote to be provocative and insightful. And she was attracted to people like Bayard Rustin, who also didn't write to be liked. And I think um uh you know all I'm it's not to say she's right or wrong. It's simply to say she was, what she was saying was not different from what some other people were saying of all different races who were thoughtful and looked at it this way. And I think it's important for us to remember that. Um,
I'm just in light. I'm not sure if this supports or contends with what you just said, but one thing I do know from Jerry Cohen about Hannah Arendt is that she sent her housekeeper's son, who was black, to college. She paid
yeah.
for, and she was in touch with him until her death. I mean, she was. I know what you're saying. She wasn't a part of the black intelligentsia, and she didn't maintain community with them. There's no denying that. But that's not to say that she was indifferent to the plight of the black community or that she harbored any negative feelings towards them.
I think that's fair. Um, I think that's very fair. Baku.
Oh, hi. I find it striking that, let's see, Arendt characterizes scientifically minded brain thrusters as people who do not think, and this phrase boldly recalls her idea of banality of evil and arguments, thoughtlessness. I remember that she used similar expressions to describe problem solvers in line in politics, and then no matter how intelligent or capable they may be, they do not think anything essential and understand the meaning of what they are doing. So, do these descriptions suggest that Arendt implicitly relates these technocratic elites to her concept of banality of evil? What do you think of that?
Thanks, Baku. Yeah, it's a great question. Um, does the question is, does the sort of thoughtlessness of the technocratic brain trusters and intellectuals in politics, which she talks about in two of these essays, right? In Lying in Politics, and now again in on violence, where she says that these folks calculate, they don't think. Um, they reckon, they don't think. Is that similar to the banality of evil, where she says of someone like Eichmann, he wasn't stupid, but he was thoughtless. Um, I think there's clearly a connection. Um, uh, there's a kind of thoughtlessness to someone like Eichmann. It comes from different places, right? Eichmann's thoughtlessness in her mind came from an inability to think from the perspective of others, to look, to understand, and try and internalize the worldview of other people. The thoughtlessness of the brain trusters, I mean, in some sense, has to have a similar ground, right? They become so hypnotized by their genius and their ability to create rational uh, thought castles of hypothesis. And the hypothesis is an hypothesis, but we talk about it, and the hypothesis suddenly is transformed into a fact, even though it was a hypothesis a few minutes ago, because we've created a sense where we said, well, that hypothesis has 70% chance of being true. And so let's take it as a fact and then move on to the next one. And if that fact is true, then the next thing has a 70% chance of being true. So that's true. And we create this chain of facts, each of which is only 70% true. But we suddenly think, oh, we've created a chain of truths, of facts that lead us to a conclusion. And what she says is it makes our common sense go to sleep. And so, yeah, it's different than Eichmann. He gets caught up in cliches and his inability to think from the perspective of other people. The brain trusters get caught up in, well, we convince ourselves by the brilliance of our analysis that what our likelihoods are facts, and then we move forward from them. And I think that there is a kind of superficiality to the thought of both. And insofar as she says that the core of banality is superficiality and inability to think broadly from the perspective of many people, I think the brain trusters are people who can't think about the complexity and nuance of the world. I mean, I wrote a piece last Sunday on in the Amor Mundi newsletter, which some of you might have read, or on the Substack, in which I said that in many ways, the success that the current administration had in Venezuela, whatever you think of whether they should or should not have done what they had in Venezuela, it worked in their mind. And it sort of led them to the belief, I think, that, military operations will achieve this and achieve this and achieve this, and they will win. And you can already see the frustration in some of the people in the administration. Like, well, we took out the leaders, we took out their things. Why aren't they capitulating? Why isn't it working? And what they forget is that just because you create an analysis doesn't mean that things are going to work out that way. And that's what Proudhon reminds us, right? That the fecundity of the world, is constantly frustrating statesmen. And that's the danger of these brain trusters. So I think you're right to see an analogy. I don't think she would call them banal, but I think she would call them thoughtless in the sense that they don't confront the fullness of reality. And so there is a similarity. It's a good point. Thanks, Baku. Lee.
Thank you.
Lee, are you there?
Can you hear me now?
Now I can.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Just before my question, you mentioned Gina Raimondo. Was that a recent article by her that you were reading?
Yeah, it's in the New York Times, I think, today,
Okay.
or in the Journal. I forget which one, but I read it
Okay.
earlier.
Yeah, I was impressed with the job she did as Commerce Secretary under Biden, and
Yeah, she's basically arguing that that we need to stop, we need to start teaching people more modular educations that will help them uh get into the workforce, and we may have to give up on this idea of liberal arts education.
yeah,
Um, you know, you know, anyway, it's you should read it.
yeah. I think she would have been a stronger
Well,
candidate than Kamala Harris. But
let's go
yeah,
forward.
yeah. Back to it. Yeah, I just wanted to uh, uh, mention that. But my question is, uh, does Arendt believe that violent rebellions always fail? Uh, I mean, she was, some of the people she includes in this essay, Sartre, for example, and Fanon, uh, they lived through the Algerian War. The Algerians had a choice between slavery, essentially, and freedom, and they had to resort to violence in order to get their freedom. The war took 8 years. As a result, 1 million Algerians lost their lives. But in the end, uh, they became independent. Uh, and so my question is, uh, uh, the Algerian conflict ended before Arendt uh, wrote this article in '69. The war lasted basically from around, I don't have the exact dates, but somewhere around 1955 to '62, and it essentially took de Gaulle to bring some wisdom and clarity into the whole
Yeah.
situation. So, uh,
Thanks,
yeah,
Lee.
good.
Yeah, I mean, so a couple things, right? One is just about the Algerian War, right? I mean, Fanon himself uh doesn't think that the Algerian Revolution succeeded, right? If you read the full book, um, you realize that by the end, he thinks that unfortunately the Algerian revolutionaries who then come to rule Algeria um, are caught up in many of the same uh, modes of oppression that the French were,
Okay.
and Arendt in Arendtian language, right? This is the idea that a liberation is not the same as a revolution. A
Right.
revolution is the constitution of freedom. Now, what your question, asks, and it's a good one, Lee, is can violence lead to a revolution? Right? Clearly, violence can lead to a liberation. Can it lead to a revolution? Arendt doesn't say no. And in fact, she will say that some violence may be necessary to for a revolution. Maybe, maybe not. Well, we'll get there. And she says sometimes violence can happen and it leads to a new foundation. But this is what she's talking about in part 3 of this text. So we'll get there in a couple weeks. But the overarching argument she makes is while violence sometimes can be productive and sometimes can lead to the foundation of freedom, more often than not, violence leads simply to more violence, right? More often than not, um, violence ends up, uh, not being able to found freedom, but leading to resentment and anger, so that other people then commit violence, and then this cycles of violence continues. And so she's not. I mean, one of the interesting things about this book, this essay, it's a long essay, so it's also published as a book. It's not pro-violence or anti-violence. She's trying to analyze the way in which violence works and how it can and how it can't found freedom. And what she says is, it can be useful. And we'll get into this, like in part 3, she talks a lot about this, but she thinks more often than not, it's counterproductive. And I think if you read the whole of, and again, I mean, one of the sad things to me about the Fanon industry in the United States today is that 90% of people who talk about Fanon don't read the whole book. Now, if you read the whole book, yeah, I mean, he still supports violence and he's not against it, but he offers a lot of examples of the way violence doesn't work and how it corrupts the very revolution that it was in the name of, and how it psychologically damages the people who engaged in it. And so it's a much more nuanced and thoughtful book than I think, unfortunately, his friends and his supporters in the academy today give it credit for being. And that's why I think Arendt is actually more supportive, more defensive of Fanon. What she really doesn't like is Sartre and his sort of radicalization of Fanon in the introduction. All right, is that helping, Leah? Lee, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. There's been a critique of Rent's views of Sartre that the question is, did he ever read Sartre's critique of dialectical reason rather than just the introduction to the book on Fanon, which he bases her argument on? But that's
Yeah.
another topic.
That's another topic, exactly. George.
Thank you. I have a question about the thoughtlessness. I mean, we do have enough violence nowadays to talk about it, so that's good. But the thoughtlessness part, it's easy to attribute it to thoughtlessness because then thoughtful people such as we can think about it and critique it that way. On the other hand, is what's going on in the Middle East right now being called, what is it, Operation Epic Fury? Is that thoughtlessness, or is that deliberate kitsch? Because I think that's what's happening. That is the thing. We're being provoked, in a sense, with deliberate kitsch into going and critiquing it intellectually, to an extent was how we're doing. But meanwhile, there's some very, very thoughtful stuff going, whether it's good thoughtful stuff or whether
Right.
this is just a manipulative thoughtful stuff is a question. But one thing they're not is thoughtless in that sense. They may be morally thoughtless, but that's a question too, because there's half the country or almost half the country, part of the country doesn't agree. But I think calling it thoughtless is the easy way out.
It's a good point. I mean, what I was calling thoughtless was the idea that we would be able to win easily, right? I think there's a real, I think that it's interesting in the right in the MAGA coalition, which is a fascinating coalition, deserves to be studied for many, many years. You have pretty divergent views that are held together. One is you still have, some, old style Republican conservative hawks. And you have people like Marco Rubio, who's sort of in the middle. And then you have, people like JD Vance and people from like Pat Buchanan's old camp and his, who are really I don't like to call themselves isolationists, but they want to call themselves non-interventionists. And I think Trump has to hold that whole coalition together. And I think his hope was that this would be a quick war that didn't cost a lot. And I think it was on the model of Venezuela. I think he was somewhat enthralled by what happened in Venezuela. And 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 I think there's a number of people in his administration and in the Pentagon and others who presented a way in which this could be done and could work. That's all I was saying. And I think that that's the kind of brain trusters that are throughout our government and our system that Arendt is, I think, talking about, which she calls a kind of thoughtlessness. It's not a moral thoughtlessness. That's not her point. It's that it's a based in somehow an unreal thoughtlessness that somehow we can calculate what's going to happen and what's likely to happen, but it stops being what's likely going to happen and it becomes what's going to happen. And we actually convince ourselves that we're smart enough to know what's going to happen. And unfortunately, it doesn't usually work out that way. Steve?
This
Oh,
Mr. Rumfeld sort of summed it up pretty well. Like stuff happens.
yeah.
So I don't think that they feel that they can actually predict things. They're trying.
Yeah.
They
They're
say,
trying.
yeah.
Thank you. Steve?
Oh, let me put in one pitch for the military leadership, and that is, it's not that if they are told the president wants to do this, then the right answer then they have choice of either resigning or coming up with a way to do it. And so it's not that it's thoughtless. It's not that they might not even believe that it's a good idea, but it's their job to do what the president tells them to do. It is the Senate's job to tell the president he can't do it. But that's not my question. Page 107. Arendt writes, the chief reason warfare is still with us is the simple fact that no substitute for this final arbiter has appeared. And I'm wondering, you said earlier that that violence occurs when authority has failed. And my question is, why can we not say, why does she not say that war occurs when politics has failed? Violence occurs when politics has failed, because politics is the resolution of issues. And if politics fails, then that's when you go to other means. And of course, this assumes first that it depends on the pool of political actors, and it also depends on an assumption of goodwill within the political realm.
Yeah, thanks. I think what she's saying is exactly what you said, Steve. She's saying that um the chief reason war is with us is not because of a death wish, right? Or, not because of these irrepressible human aggression that some of these social anthropologists talk about, nor economic and social dangers and disarmament, right? Not that's the reason, but because we need war, because politics will always fail at some point, and in the history of humanity, when politics fails, there's been no other way to address the problem but war. And so war is part of human political life. Um, and so and whenever politics fails, war is the answer. What I think is fascinating about her analysis here, and what she adds to that, because that's Clausewitz, that's fairly common. What I think she adds to it and is fascinating is what she's saying is, in the modern world, we're confronting an issue, which is that war is no longer possible in the sense of total war, right? And this is something you see, in many conflicts that have been going on for many years, like in the Middle East. Whenever one side is winning, they don't do what they might have done at another time, which is annihilate their enemy or finish the war, because doing so would be so destructive that it would, that we can't justify it. And so the war sort of stops, and then it starts again, and it stops and it starts again. And what she's saying is, we've reached a point in which actually winning a war is so horrific that we won't do it. And the result is that we fight these mini wars, right? But we don't actually fight to win. And while that's good because we don't want to fight to win because it's so destructive, it's bad because we still don't have any other means to solve problems that politics can't solve. And so we get these eternal conflicts that, are hot and cold for generations, but never actually resolved. And I think sadly, I think that analysis is right, and it reflects a lot of the major conflicts in the world today. Rachel.
Hi. Yeah, I'd like to go back to what we were talking about before about the connection between, today's brain trust and military technocrats and Adolf Eichmann and not thinking. Isn't another way of saying that they're similar is that they both lack judgment. They weren't thinking, they weren't having that dialogue between me and myself. They weren't getting they don't, and even today with Trump's administration, they don't have the input of that, so-called team of rivals to bring in opposing viewpoints. And, that's even the difference between Trump's first administration and this one, that there's no other to bring in those other perspectives. I mean, that was kind of also my understanding of the banality of evil with Eichmann. There was no other input. Would you agree with that?
I mean, so first of all, I think that um the lack of listening and thinking to other perspectives is widespread throughout our culture on all sides of the political spectrum. But yes, I think that it is a problem, and so far as the administration has largely staffed itself with loyalists and yes sayers, which I think is undeniable. Um, you know, it leads to a kind of echo chamber and thoughtlessness that is profound and dangerous. But I think Arendt is not talking about that, right? She's talking about the people in the agencies all the way through, the people who claim to be nonpartisan, the claim to be, you know, rational and thoughtful and analytical. Those are the people she's talking about. The people that we often think we want them in charge because they went to Harvard and Yale and Stanford and wherever, and they, are taught to, think rationally and critically. And what she's saying is it's those people who, even though they've been taught to think rationally and critically, too often are not rational and critical. They're building systems of calculations that actually are not are separating them from the world and in a sense cutting them off from reality because they take an analysis of the world, but then they say, okay, that's now a fact, and they move on. And you can see it in so many different, if you look at if you read reports that come out of think tanks or governmental agencies, you can see the way they move step by step and set up these hypotheses and then assume that the hypotheses are true. And that's what she's talking about. And so I think it's a little too easy to say, oh, it's what Trump is doing. Because I don't think that's what she's talking about, or what Biden did, or whatever. I think she's talking about, people in economics and political science departments in colleges, right? And in think tanks. They are too caught up in their own intelligence, and they think they can predict the world or make the world comprehensible. And Arendt says, really you can't. And that's the danger. And as these people think they can make the world comprehensible and predictable, then they think, oh, well, then we can go and bomb someone because we think we know what's going to happen. But of course, it doesn't always work out that way. And that's what we're, unfortunately, I think, I mean, we'll see. You never know. Maybe it will work out that way. And maybe this will lead to peace in the Middle East. But I think the chances are not as good as some people would like them to be.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you all. We are at a little over time. enjoy reading. Jess, when are we meeting next? Do we meet next week?
Yes, so there's a meeting next week, and then the next couple of weeks are off. I'll put it in the chat once again, but you can find on hac.bard.edu as well.
Yeah, so we do meet next week, and then we have 2 weeks off, I believe, before we get to part 3. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. Carry on, and we'll see you next week. Thanks all very much.